Κύριε Πρωθυπουργέ, κύριε Δήμαρχε, Υπουργοί, Πρέσβεις, κυρίες και κύριοι. Ονομάζομαι Αχιλλέας Τσάλτας και είμαι αντιπρόεδρος της International New York Times. Καλησπέρα σας και καλωσορίσατε σε αυτόν τον ιερό χώρο, στη στοά του Ατάλου, στην αρχαία αγορά. Με τα προβλήματα και τους πολέμους που αντιμετωπίζει η Ιφίλιος σήμερα, αυτός πραγματικά είναι ο ιερότερος χώρος στον οποίο πρέπει να επανέλθουμε για να αξιολογήσουμε την εξέλιξη της δημοκρατίας. Στον ιερό χώρο της Ακρόπολης και της Πνίκας. Στα αγγλικά τώρα, στη γλώσσα της εφημερίδας μας, θα έλεγα «This, ladies and gentlemen, is our North Star». A year ago, President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing spoke from this same podium on the International Day of Democracy, the day we are marking here today. He pointed to this statue and so eloquently said that democracy is a Greek goddess who has survived many pressures and tests through history. President Giscard offered us hope and a reference point, a North Star, on which we can reorient ourselves when democracy is under pressure. Our topic today. Yes, this is the place where democracy was born 2,500 years ago, when Pericles made it the foundation of his golden age and the cornerstone for Western civilization. But these ruins also remind us that for more than 2,000 years, democracy went into hibernation, only to emerge again with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. It took life in the rebellion of the American colonies against British rule and survived the massive upheavals of the last century, the great wars and totalitarianism, to become, by the end of the century, the dominant political system of the world. To paraphrase Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the free peoples of the world succeeded in shielding the great flame of democracy from the blackout of barbarism. But the barbarians are back at the door, and that's why we are here today. We all know what has happened to the Arab Spring, to the hopes of the Maidan, and in many other places. Even in the United States, for many the shining beacon of democracy, there are dark clouds. A recent Princeton University study of the past 30 years concluded that the American political system has changed from a democracy to an oligarchy of the super wealthy elite and powerful lobbies, a thesis also advanced by the French economist Thomas Piketty. In Europe, economic turmoil has given rise to populist parties opposed to many of the principles that have guided the West for decades. As our panel discussions at the Acropolis Museum this morning illustrated, democracy today is confronted with three momentous forces. Firstly, there are the political whirlwinds shaped and elsewhere. Secondly, there are the forces of globalization and the inequalities that they shape. And thirdly, there are the new media and the digital revolution that are changing the way people follow the world. The goddess of democracy is again intense under pressure to adapt and to evolve to this new revolution we are undergoing. And what a joy, ladies and gentlemen, to be gathered again at this altar of civilization, so kindly opened to us by Minister Kefalogiannis and Minister Tassoulas. Thank you. Last year, the International New York Times and our esteemed partner Kathimerini started a journey with the United Nations Democracy Fund to celebrate, to reflect, to debate the plight of democracy on the day proclaimed by the United Nations as International Democracy Day. We believe that event was a success, so this year we and the Athens Forum for Democracy have expanded the event to a full day. And we have assembled 4 veteran journalists of the New York Times in the one event to moderate panels of leading experts on the plight of democracy. The subject matter certainly speaks to the mission of the New York Times to enhance society and support democracy by providing impartial and thorough news from around the world. My deep thanks to the moderators and to the panelists. I also want to thank 6 prominent companies that have truly showed their foresight and leadership in helping this project to life. I'm talking about the National Bank of Greece, Google, Eldorado Gold, Aegean, Volvo, and DEPA. These companies are showing great vision by their sponsorship of a discussion on the pressures of democracy, not an easy topic. We applaud and appreciate your support and trust that we can be partners also in the future. And of course, Mr. Prime Minister and Mr. Mayor, our thanks to Greece and Athens, our North Star. We at the New York Times and Kathimerini are grateful to Secretary General of the United Nations Ban Ki-moon for his message, and Annika Saville at the United Nations Democracy Fund will be representing him today. We are also thankful for the Athens Democracy Forum, led by Simeon Somokos and Alberto Cano, for your significant role in bringing and organizing this commemoration of democracy today. We look forward to a rich discussion led by our columnist, Roger Cohen, at the New York Times. Before that, it is my true pleasure to thank the Prime Minister. Mr. Samaras, we very much remember your wise words from a year ago here on this podium when you warned us against the dangers of the rise of extremists and populist parties that are polarizing society, as you said. A phenomenon, of course, that is not limited to Greece. It is an honor, sir, that you have found time to join us again this year. Ladies and gentlemen, before we invite the Prime Minister for the keynote address of the day, we have some brief welcome remarks from the Mayor of Athens and from the United Nations. So, Mr. Mayor, custodian of the City of Democracy, the floor is yours.
Κύριε Πρωθυπουργέ, κυρίες και κύριοι Υπουργοί, φίλες και φίλοι, κυρίες και κύριοι. Σας καλωσορίζω και φέτος στην Αθήνα τη Διεθνή ημέρα της Δημοκρατίας. Δεν σας κρύβω ωστόσο ότι τη μεγάλη μου χαρά για την διοργάνωση και το υψηλό επίπεδο των προσκεκλημένων την μετριάζει το ίδιο το θέμα του φόρουμ. Όπως και πέρσι, συζητάμε για μια δημοκρατία υποπίεση, μια δημοκρατία σε καθεστώς δημοσιονομικής και πολιτικής κρίσης. Και η ατζέντα μας είναι πάνω κάτω ίδια, γιατί ενώ πλέον μπορούμε με μεγαλύτερη σαφήνεια να μιλήσουμε για την κρίση, παραμένει μετέωρος στον λόγο, κυρίως όμως στην πράξη μας, το σχέδιο εξόδου από αυτήν. Παρότι γνωρίζουμε καλά το τι συνέβη τα τελευταία 5 χρόνια, η δημοκρατία μοιάζει εγκλωβισμένη ανάμεσα στη ροπή προς τα πίσω και την φυγή προς τα εμπρός. Στην Ελλάδα βιώσαμε μία βίαιη δημοσιονομική προσαρμογή. Η βελτίωση των οικονομικών δικτών και η μετάβαση από τα διονγκωμένα ελλείμματα στα έστω και οριακά πλεονάσματα είναι σημάδια σταδιακής εξομάλυνσης. Δημιουργούνται πια οι αναγκαίες συνθήκες για την πολιτική σταθερότητα. Και όταν αναφέρομαι στην σταθερότητα, δεν εννοώ, φίλες και φίλοι, την τρέχουσα πολιτική, δηλαδή τις κομματικές συγκρούσεις και σκοπιμότητες, αλλά την προσήλωση στο πολιτικό, με την υψηλή έννοια της σύνθεσης των κοινωνικών διαφορών, της εξυπηρέτησης του δημοσίου συμφέροντος και της εμβάθυνσης στην ευρωπαϊκή πορεία της χώρας. Η αποσυμπίεση όμως της δημοκρατίας παραμένει ακόμη εκρεμής. Οι πολίτες, στην μεγάλη πλειοψηφία τους, έχουν υποφέρει από το βάρος της δημοσιονομικής κρίσης και στην Ελλάδα ακόμη υποφέρουν. Η ανεργία των νέων, η συρρίκνωση της μεσαίας τάξης και η εξόντωση των χαμηλών στρωμάτων φωτίζουν το βασικό χαρακτηριστικό κάθε κρίσης της δημοκρατίας. Την απόσταση ανάμεσα στην κοινωνία και στο κράτος, ανάμεσα στους πολίτες και τους κυβερνώντες. Όσο τα τραύματα της κρίσης δεν επουλώνονται, τόσο οι πολίτες θα νιώθουν ότι το ιδιωτικό τους συμφέρον αποκλίνει από το γενικό καλό. Και η ίδια η απόσταση είναι αυτή που δημιουργεί την κρίση της νομιμοποίησης, της πολιτικής εξουσίας και την απώλεια της εμπιστοσύνης στους πολιτικούς. Η δημοκρατία έχει πληγεί τα τελευταία χρόνια και στην μορφή και στην ουσία της, τόσο στο εθνικό επίπεδο, όσο και στο ευρωπαϊκό, καθώς η κρίση φανέρωσε προς πάσα κατεύθυνση πια το δημοκρατικό έλλειμμα της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης, όπως και το ζήτημα νομιμοποίησης των μηχανισμών διαχείρισης της κρίσης. Αγαπητοί φίλοι, έτσι άνθησε το λεγόμενο μίσος για τη δημοκρατία, καθώς αυτή φαντάζει στα μάτια πολλών ως μια ψευδής υπόσχεση. Η πίεση στην δημοκρατία προκύπτει από την αδυναμία της στις συνθήκες της κρίσης να δώσει νόημα στην ιδιότητα του πολίτη. Να εγγυηθεί δηλαδή το δικαίωμα του καθενός να διαμορφώνει τη ζωή του όπως αυτός επιθυμεί, δίχως διακρίσεις, αποκλεισμούς και ανισότητες υλικές ή πολιτισμικές. Όταν όμως ο πολίτης αισθάνεται πλήρως αμέτωχος στη λήψη των αποφάσεων, μακριά από το κέντρο της εξουσίας και της διακυβέρνησης, τότε ο προσωπικός του θυμός μεταφράζεται σε πολιτική πράξη και σε επιθυμία για αντιδημοκρατική εκτροπή. Στην κρίση της αντιπροσωπευτικής δημοκρατίας, εμείς απαντάμε με την δική μας σύγχρονη πρόταση, η οποία εμπεριέχει και την έννοια της τοπικής δημοκρατίας. Και θα προσέθετα στο σημείο αυτό ότι οι προσπάθειες που κάνουμε στην Αθήνα γίνονται σε μια χρονική περίοδο που ο ρόλος των πόλεων και ευρύτερα η δυναμική του αστικού κέντρου αποκτούν μια νέα διάσταση σε ευρωπαϊκό και διεθνές επίπεδο. Η αναγνώριση ότι οι πόλεις και ειδικότερα οι δημοτικές τους αρχές, θεσμοί που βρίσκονται κοντύτερα στον πολίτη και τα προβλήματά του, μπορούν να δώσουν λύσεις εκεί όπου τα κράτη συχνά αποτυγχάνουν, η αποδοχή αυτή είναι πια ευρεία. Όμως τα τοπικά προβλήματα έχουν πολύ συχνά υπερεθνική διάσταση. Γι' αυτό και η ενεργό συμμετοχή των πολιτών και των πόλεων στη χάραξη και καθοδήγηση των ευρωπαϊκών πολιτικών, αλλά και γενικότερα των παγκόσμιων πρωτοβουλειών, είναι πολύτιμη. Ειδικότερα για την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, οι δήμοι και οι περιφέρειες θα πρέπει να αποκτήσουν πια ουσιαστικό ρόλο στην εφαρμογή της στρατηγικής Ευρώπη 2020 και να αναδειχθούν σε ισότιμους παράγοντες μέσω της πολυεπίπεδης διακυβέρνησης. Όχι μόνο προκειμένου η δράση της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης να πετύχει συγκεκριμένα αποτελέσματα και στόχους, αλλά και γιατί η ενεργοποίηση των πόλεων και των ερετών εκπροσώπων τους αποτελεί σημαντικό όχημα για τη μείωση του δημοκρατικού ελλείμματος στην Ευρώπη. Είναι θετικό ότι τα υπάρχοντα παγκόσμια και ευρωπαϊκά δίκτυα πόλεων διαρκώς ενισχύονται, ανταλλάσσουν καλές πρακτικές, διεκδικούν ολοένα και μεγαλύτερο ρόλο στη διαμόρφωση στρατηγικών. Ο Δήμος Αθήνας τα τελευταία χρόνια παίζει ενεργό ρόλο στις πρωτοβουλίες που αναπτύσσονται. Όχι ως παρατηρητής ή ως απλός δέκτης συμβουλευτικής υποστήριξης, αλλά ως ενεργός συνδιαμορφωτής των στρατηγικών που αναπτύσσονται και των προτάσεων που υποβάλλονται. Αυτό είναι στην ουσία και το μεταρρυθμιστικό μας πρόγραμμα στον Δήμο της Αθήνας, στην πόλη που τα τελευταία χρόνια έχει ζήσει με την μεγαλύτερη ένταση όλες τις φάσεις της κρίσης. Μία πρόταση πολιτική που με αφετηρία τις τοπικές υποθέσεις φιλοδοξούμε να αποτελέσει παράδειγμα για την δημοκρατική άσκηση της εξουσίας συνολικά. Σας ευχαριστώ για την προσοχή σας.
Ευχαριστούμε κύριε Δήμαρχε για τον χαιρετισμό σας. Ladies and gentlemen, may I invite Annika Saville, who's the executive head of the United Nations Democracy Fund. She will speak to us in this capacity, but also representing Secretary General. Annika.
Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Mayor, Excellencies and generous hosts, I am so grateful to be back and to be part of building this new and expanding tradition in the ancient Agora. Please forgive me if I join the long line of foreigners who come to Athens and talk about Pericles. His ears must be burning more than ever today. As we observe this International Day of Democracy, we've all had reason to quote him. But Pericles might have asked, do we actually have reason to celebrate? He might even have wondered, as we meet here in the cradle of democracy, whether some places are becoming democracy's graveyard. Pericles' Athens was a city open to all the world with no aliens laws. Today, around Europe, xenophobia is taking hold in even some of the most established democracies. Athenian democracy advocated tolerance and freedom. In our world, hate, crimes, and extremism proliferate every day. Athenian democracy paid special regard to laws for the protection of the oppressed. Today, some emerging movements seek to impose laws for the very oppression of humankind. On the other hand, Pericles might have chuckled that Athenian democracy's practice of ostracism, where thousands would vote on shards of pottery to expel a potential tyrant, may be the equivalent of the recent mass protests in Kiev's Euromaidan. Ladies and gentlemen, my answer would be that in the midst of all the turmoil, there is reason to celebrate. Here in Greece, in the past few years, democracy was challenged by crisis. Yet Greece is coming out of the crisis not through juntas or autocratic rule, but by democratic means. And globally, democracy champions are manifesting extraordinary courage against extraordinary obstacles. I spent the past few weeks at UN headquarters in New York negotiating several new projects for the UN Democracy Fund. The projects include civic education in Sierra Leone's eastern provinces, even though this is where the Ebola epidemic has taken one of the biggest tolls so far. Building safe and secure independent journalism in Libya, even though recently chaos and violence has displaced hundreds of thousands of people there. And strengthening democratic practices in local governance in Ukraine, including the east of the country. This is a region where the ongoing issues speak for themselves. These and other UNDEF projects will go on undeterred. They are all implemented by local civil society groups who fight against the odds every day. As Pericles said, freedom belongs to those who have the courage to defend it. Prime Minister Samaras, last year at this forum, we were deeply moved by your perspective from modern Athens, and we look forward to being inspired by you again. And we look forward to hearing from two veteran thinkers and doers in the democratic arena, Danilo Turk of Slovenia and Carl Bildt of Sweden. The presence of both visiting leaders holds special symbolic significance. 25 years ago this month, the Assembly of Slovenia passed constitutional amendments that introduced parliamentary democracy to the country. And yesterday, Sweden voted for change in general elections with a turnout of almost 84%. Carl Bildt, special thanks to you for flying straight from the ballot box to the birthplace of democracy. These examples illustrate that a stable democracy is not an unchanging one. It is one where change is managed peacefully and inclusively. That both visiting leaders have a distinguished past with the United Nations makes that point even more telling. Ladies and gentlemen, in your printed programs, you have a personal message from the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who sends his best wishes to you. Let me quote briefly from it. Gatherings like the Athens Forum are living proof that inclusive participation is not only an end in itself. It prepares communities, societies, and entire countries to address opposing points of view and engage in constructive criticism and deliberations. I hope that the Athens Forum will encourage world leaders to hear, respond appropriately to the voices of the people, whether expressed directly or through elected representatives. On this day of democracy, may the spirit of Athens inspire communities and nations to work for inclusive democracy right around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annika. And now for the International Democracy Day keynote speech, I present to you the Prime Minister of the Hellenic Republic.
Listening to those cicadas or crickets, if you wish, Your Excellencies, allow me to say something that came to my mind from a Greek poem. I'll say it in Greek. Και πολλά τα τζιτζίκια που να μην τα νιώθεις, όπως δεν νιώθεις τους σφιγμούς στο χέρι σου. Όπως είναι αυτονόητος ο σφιγμός στο χέρι, σφιγμή στο χέρι μας. Έτσι σε αυτόν εδώ το βλογημένο τρόπο και το βλογημένο τόπο αυτόν. Είναι αυτονόητη η δημοκρατία. Και κάπου εδώ θα τριγυρνούσε ο ποιητής όταν έγραψε αυτούς τους στίχους. Excellencies, may I first congratulate the organizers for turning the Democracy Under Pressure Forum into an international annual event, which will always have all the necessary support, obviously, from the Greek government. Dear friends, we are living in interesting times, as the Chinese say. Of course, in our case, interesting is only an understatement, and the Chinese meant it in an ironic way as a synonym for crisis. But democracy under pressure does not necessarily mean crisis. Democracy is not just an institutional context of governance. It is the guarantee of political freedom, social justice, citizens' responsibilities, human dignity, opportunities, the effort for prosperity for all. Democracy is about all of them, not some of them. It guarantees all of these features. If one is missing, democracy has corrective mechanisms to attain it back. It takes time. It does not happen momentarily. But democracy is a dynamic system. It works if people believe in themselves, individually and collectively. It works if they share common values, shaping up their common identity. If they are willing and capable of assuming responsibilities. If they do believe in their common future. Indeed, democracy works if they have hope as a society, and if they base such a hope on truth, as well as on their collective determination to succeed as a society in the future. Dignity is of utmost importance. People may lose some of their wealth and still keep their dignity. If this is the case, then democracy has no problem. Prosperity will soon come back. Freedom is also of utmost significance, and social cohesion also. A democratic society does not sacrifice freedom to maintain its unity, and does not sacrifice its unity to attain freedom. Those two are inseparable. Freedom relies on citizens' rights that are fully matched by citizens' responsibilities. Responsibilities without rights lead to authoritarianism, and democracy starts falling apart. On the other hand, rights without responsibilities lead to social unrest and political collapse, and then both society and democracy fall apart. Common values are also essential. Only citizens sharing the same identity can form a community that can be self-governed. Democratic debate, and this is where the initial debates took place in history. Democratic debate can only take place and produce consensus results if it is based on the common interest, so that everybody accepts the majority rule. Because only if citizens share common values can they debate on their common prospects. Citizens presuppose a city. In other words, a community of people sharing common values and common identity. Without this sense of belonging, people are just individuals, trying either to impose themselves upon others or separate themselves from others. Whatever undermines or destroys this sense of belonging is always very detrimental for democracy in the long run. And finally, the two T's, trust and truth. Trust of citizens to their common prospects as a community, and trust based on the truth. Societies can go through hardships. They can sail through rough waters, trying times, and difficult moments, as we've done in this country. Only if they believe in their common prospects and base this belief on the truth. If they know where they stand, where they want to go, if they are aware of all obstacles lying ahead and are determined to do what it takes to achieve their goals. If this is the case, democracies can release enormous potential out of the community and its people. No hardship will ever derail them. But if they don't believe in themselves, if they have no trust to their common prospects, if they prefer sweet lies to hard truth, then they usually stumble from one disappointment to the next, and this generates public discontent, dividing the society, weakening the community bonds, and eventually destroying society, destroying democracy. So trust based on truth is a necessary ingredient for citizens to assume responsibilities, sustain difficulties, thus making democracy to work. Ladies and gentlemen, indeed, democracy is not just a set of legalistic rules. It is alive, it grows, it evolves. It can go through crisis, but it possesses corrective mechanisms. It has its own antibodies. So most of the time it overcomes its problems, survives, recuperates, and grows stronger than before. Therefore, pressure is not a problem for democracy. Democracies live through pressures and evolve under pressure. The problem is when the corrective mechanisms of democracy fail one after the other, when the preconditions for its functioning are weakened, or when many different pressures coincide simultaneously. In such a case, we don't have ordinary pressures anymore. We are facing a real crisis then. In periods of crisis, we have two different destabilizing factors, both being fed by the crisis, both being fed by each other. In other words, both weakening the antibodies of democracy and destabilizing the social fabric and the democratic legitimacy. These two evils are populism and extremism. They have different faces. Sometimes they are distinct. Sometimes they are mixed together, but they are always interrelated. They destroy the community's sense of belonging. They spread out fear and disillusionment. They invoke conspiracy theories and doomsday scenarios. They try to eliminate trust to common prospects. They are divisive. They comprise together the perfect recipe for social collapse, fear of the outside world, and internal hate. Lies and mistrust are their common base. If they succeed, society gets paralyzed. Democracy fails to produce any consensus. Public order breaks down. Public security is jeopardized. Democratic legitimacy is weakened and violence erupts, leading to a fracture of social cohesion and failure of democracy. Populism relies mainly on sweet lies, on false promises of easy solutions and quick fixes, totally unsubstantiated but very attractive, leading, of course, to grave disappointments and to social unrest. Extremism relies on hate and unmasked violence, widespread expectations of disaster, and nihilist ideologies, leading to the complete breakdown of public order and democratic legitimacy. Populism often feeds the fire of extremism, and vice versa. The underlying crisis is their common breeding ground, and together they generate a vicious cycle, a devastating process during which social cohesion and democracy usually fall apart. So what do we do during such crises to avert those twin evils of populism and extremism? For starters, we fight the lies with the truth. Fight politics of hate by re-establishing dignity and fundamental belief in community values and common prospects. Re-establish hope based on truth and social cohesion based on public security, democratic legitimacy, and prospects of prosperity for all. But how do we do that? With reforms, sweeping reforms, well-orchestrated reforms, by reinvigorating symbols that re-establish national unity and social cohesion, by addressing pressing issues of social justice and public order, by correcting long-standing distortions so that people can start believing in the reforms. Remember that you cannot fix everything overnight, but you cannot drag your feet either. You first have to give people a chance to realize the potential of the reforms so they can sustain the discomfort of the initial changes. Timing, therefore, is very essential. You must go ahead with all the reforms necessary to bring society back on its feet and regenerate trust to its common prospects. But at the same time, you must make your reform program compatible with the political cycle. Because without democratic legitimacy, no reform program can survive in the long run. And because reforms will only succeed if they generate their own momentum in the society. Otherwise, populism and extremism will eventually get the opportunity to derail reforms, and democracy for that matter. So if anybody wants to talk about democracy under extraordinary pressures, Greece is the perfect place to look upon today. 2 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, this country was falling apart. It was running enormous budget deficits. Its nominal debt was exploding. A long-lasting recession was running deeper and unemployment was increasing to unprecedented levels. The world markets were closed for Greece, and most of our partners, although still providing loans to us, were publicly questioning whether we would be able to stay within the Eurozone. At the same time, public order was in jeopardy, while strikes were becoming an everyday routine, and capital was fleeing from the country. Today, the picture is completely different. We've already achieved a primary surplus in our budget for 2013, 1 year ahead of the program. We are running a bigger primary surplus for 2014, better than the program target. We are expected to almost balance our overall budget by next year, 2015, covering on top of our primary balance interest payments on our debt for the first time in many decades. We are thus completing the largest fiscal adjustment in history in the shortest time ever. And at the same time, we've implemented structural reforms at an unprecedented scale. Within 2 years, we jumped from position 147th place to the 36th place in the World Competitiveness Rating, according to the World Bank survey. 111 positions up. And at the same time, despite the painful austerity, we managed to put an end to recession. In the current third quarter 2014, our GDP will be positive for the first time in 24 quarters. After 6 years of recession, recovery is ante portas, especially now when our banks are becoming fully recapitalized. Unemployment, incredibly high, intolerably high, but it has already started falling. Small portions, but falling. And our debt, still very high as a percentage of GDP, has started nominally falling for the first time in decades. Public order is steadily improving. Our tourism will post a new historical record in 2014 of more than 20 million visitors after last year's record of 18. 20 million. 2 tourists for each Greek. And finally, last April, we got out in the markets, 2 years ahead of schedule. New Greek bonds have been well received by the world financial community and have been constantly improving since. We are grateful to our partners for all of their support, but we are moving fast to the point where we will be able to deal with our financial and fiscal problems on our own, as was the case with Ireland and Portugal. Of course, the reforms will go on. The jump of 111 places in the World Competitiveness Rating is remarkable, but we're going to move further up to the real top places of world competitiveness. This is a truly solid and credible guarantee of long-term sustainable growth. And speaking as an economist, I will say that this is the only guarantee for long-term sustainable growth. So populism and extremism will lose their chance. During the most difficult moments of the crisis, they failed to gain new ground. Now that we will be getting out of the crisis, populism and extremism will steadily subside. Indeed, many people suffered during the last years. We have completely reversed the downward trend of our society, but it was hard and painful, very hard and very painful. And frankly speaking, I do not know of many democratic societies which could sustain such seismic changes and incredible reforms in such a short time. The important thing I want to stress is that despite their legitimate grievances, the Greek people did not turn to populism and extremism. They both got stronger, yes, but not strong enough to derail our reform process or our democracy for that matter. Now that the worst is over, things are going to improve, and liberal democracy, along with European ideals, will pull the country through its worst crisis in the post-war decades. There will be no dreadful Weimar Republic scenario for Greece. The numbers show it, the world markets know it, our partners admit to it, the rating agencies are confirming it, Greece is back. But our effort is not over yet. The enemies of reforms are launching their last campaign to derail what we have achieved so far. Lots of populist false promises, lots of petty politic quick fixes that, if materialized, would bring the country back to the worst moments of 2011. And I can foresee that the more they fail to present themselves as a credible alternative, the more false promises, the more fraudulent commitments will be spread around. But Greece is coming successfully to the end of the program, And nobody is going to make our country a modern Sisyphus. 2 years ago, we were the weakest link in Europe. Now we're becoming the most stable country in a destabilizing region. Everybody realizes the huge geopolitical turbulence around us. Everybody understands that Greek stability and Greek growth prospects, so direly attained in the past 2 years, cannot be wasted, cannot be sacrificed on the altar of populism and extremism. These days are over for good. Greece is back. We're getting out of the crisis because our democracy withstood the pressures. And this painful experience will only make us better as an economy, stronger as a country, more united as a society, and wiser as a people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Samaras, for that hopeful message. Greece is back. Europe owes a great debt, I would say, to your resolve. No country has been through such a radical or painful adjustment in peacetime in Europe for a very long time. And Greece is now, as you said, beginning to emerge from the crisis. Well, we've heard a lot about democracy today, and to debate it here this evening, I would like to invite Danilo Turk, the former president of Slovenia, and Carl Bildt, who has asked me to describe him as the outgoing Prime Minister of Sweden. I'm not, however, ready to do that. I'm going to call you the Foreign Minister of Sweden still, Carl. So if you would please join me up here on the stage. Prime Minister, we understand the pressure of your work and that you are going to have to slip away at some point. But before then, once again, many thanks for joining us here this evening. Well, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to question democracy in this setting must be something close to heresy, especially when the cradle of the great democratic idea turns out to be so beautiful. I mean, with all respect to the German ambassador who's here tonight, imagine if democracy had been birthed in Düsseldorf. We might feel somewhat differently about it. But nothing against Düsseldorf, great football team, but you know, this is a wonderful setting to celebrate democracy. But it is our task tonight to question democracy in this moment when it's being challenged. And of course, interrogation, debate, and the peaceful resolution of differences lie at the very core of the democratic idea. They are its lifeblood, e pluribus unum. Now, Churchill once said, and I'm not going to give you the famous quote, he once said that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Democracy is laborious, it's imperfect, it's difficult, but it's also resilient, as Greece has demonstrated, because of those very imperfections, and it's unpredictable. It can resist challenges, and once roused, it can show a fierce anger. And Churchill, of course, in the end concluded that it was better than any alternative. As Achilles suggested, its history has been anything but smooth. After Athenian democracy, there was a lacuna of a couple of millennia. Then with the Enlightenment came its rebirth, and it took wing with the American Revolution. But even in America, it was incomplete. Slavery, of course, existed. And the United States went through a terrible civil war. Now, I'll use any excuse to quote Lincoln, so allow me to remind you that in 1863, Lincoln reminded us all of the task that remained. We here highly resolve that those dead shall not have died in vain. that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Well, perish it almost did in the 20th century, and we know why. But with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, all seemed to be well. A consensus on liberal democratic governance was thought to have been reached. The end of history was talked about. Bill Clinton suggested in 1997 that great power territorial politics was so 20th century. It was over. A new era had dawned. Enlightened self-interest, he said, as well as shared values, will compel countries to define their greatness in a different way. Well, it was not to be, and perhaps tonight in our debate we could look at why not. Was it some failing of the West that meant that those dreams, that vision did not come true, or was it inevitable that as throughout history, great nations would start competing again and offering different systems to their citizens? And now, a quarter century on, democracy does indeed face great challenges. I'll just list a few before we get going on the debate. One is clearly the new authoritarianisms of China, Russia. They can appear more decisive, bolder, more longer term in their thinking. As Mike Ignatieff has observed, capitalism turned out to be politically promiscuous. It was just as at home with Chinese authoritarianism as with German democracy. We had the terrible failure, and I was wrong about it, of the Arab Spring. All those great hopes I witnessed in Tahrir Square and in Benghazi, this moment when it seemed young Arabs wanted to join the modern world, they wanted agency. That's what democracy is about, agency. I, a small individual, can do some small thing that may change my life. And that's what the uprising was about. Powered by new media, it was about bringing young people into the modern world. And now we see 175,000 dead in Syria and recorded beheadings, British jihadis beheading British aid workers in the desert. Why did the Arab Spring have to fail? I used to mock the idea that there might be something in the Arab genome that meant that that great swathe of the world was somehow unready or unsuited to democracy. But why is it that it could not take root? Then, of course, as we've discussed today, there's been the force of globalization. National parliaments can seem like the horse and cart in an age of hyperconnectivity. National political systems cannot keep up with the pace of the modern world. And in an age in which Facebook and Twitter play such a large role, it often seems that our leaders are just reduced to short-termism. China may be planning a decade ahead. David Cameron and François Hollande are looking at the next hour. They are battered and buffeted all the time by what is the latest tweet from so-and-so or the latest news flash on some network. And it seems that we don't have politicians anymore, or we have very few who are prepared to speak of some bold vision, if not for Europe, at least for something. Often that seems to be lacking. And that gives rise to frustrations, along with, of course, the economic crisis. And we see the Sweden Democrats, we see Marine Le Pen in France, Golden Dawn here. The challenge of populism and extremism has been very well described by Prime Minister Samaras. And in the United States, my country, leader of democracy, that's the way it's always seen itself. The United States is an idea. Without that idea, it ceases to exist. It's more than a country, it's an idea. And intrinsic to that idea is the notion that freedom and democracy should spread around the world. But after the meltdown of 2008, after the botched attempt to spread democracy through the war in Iraq, with money, lobbies, gridlock, partisanship, paralyzing democracy, the government shutting down, what is the image of American democracy in the world today? And when that image becomes negative, clearly democracy has problems. Well, to discuss all this, we're privileged to have President Turk and Foreign Minister Bildt. And I'd like to start, Carl, by, you're a strong defender of democracy. Your government, over 8 years, has done wonders. The Swedish economy has not been in better shape for a very long time. The deficit's been slashed, people are living better. Sweden has been one of the success stories in Europe. And yet this weird system, this weird democratic system, has just thrown you out. How can you support such a perverse system?
Well, we should have recruited you for the election campaign, that's fairly obvious. No, as said, you said that democracy never survives a 5-minute encounter with the average voter. I've had more than 5 minutes during the last few weeks, and I'm still a fervent believer in democracy. I think what happens, and that's a good thing in a sense, in democracies, is that people sometimes want change. There was another famous thinker, Lord Acton, who said that power corrupts. I'm not quite certain that power corrupts in our democracies, but I do think that regular changes now and then is, as a matter of fact, rather healthy. And any government that has been there for too long, successful or failed, faces that feeling among people that perhaps some other people should be allowed to try their best on the governance of the country. And long term, however painful it is when you lose an election, long term, you know that that is perhaps good for the health and the vitality of the political system. I'm coming from a country where, due to an old election system in the past, we had one party governing for nearly 4 decades. That was exceedingly bad for the country, and it was exceedingly bad for that particular political party. Since then, we have changed back and forth over the years, and we are now a more vital, dynamic democracy than we were previously. So, you win some, you lose some, that's democracy, but the vitality of the country is, after all, something that is most important.
So you think change is positive despite your defeat, but the Sweden Democrats, who are a right-wing, anti-immigrant party, exactly the kind of party we've been talking about as a symbol of the malaise of Western democracies, it's more than doubled its vote share. It's now the 3rd party in Sweden. Does this suggest that indeed democracy is ailing, even in Scandinavia?
No, I wouldn't say that. But
so how do you explain it?
As you point out, it was a fairly bizarre election result in the sense that we lost, and the parliamentary opposition, the leftists, they didn't win. Why should be fair to them? They gained 0.1%, which is virtually nothing. And it was this national populist party, the Sweden Democrat, that more than doubled. What is that? Because it's not unique Swedish. I think, to take another sort of phrase out of political theory, not Greek, but related to Greece, you remember Karl Popper, his famous book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, first part of it, when he has his critique of Plato, and he says that democracy, yes, it does work, but there is what he calls the strain of civilization. Democracy is demanding, and sometimes people feel that demands of change and whatever are too great. And then there is what he called the strain of civilization and the risk of people falling back in what he called tribalism. And that, I think, is what we are seeing throughout Europe. Too many changes, globalization, they feel left behind, they see foreign faces on the streets that they are not used to, and then the strain of civilization creates the breeding ground for the populism and the extremism, and they are expressed in these particular political parties. You've seen them, as the Prime Minister said, in Greece. There was an election result in Germany yesterday as well, which from that point of view was not particularly good. I'm still optimistic. We've seen this before. We can deal with it in a democratic way, but that, I think, is the phenomenon we are seeing.
Do you accept the idea that democracy is in crisis, that the 21st century has seen a retreat of democracy, as some of the numbers suggest? The Economist is pushing hard on the idea that democracy is going backward. Do you accept the idea, or? momentary, fleeting, fashionable idea, but in fact, democracy is as strong as ever?
I think democracy as an idea is as strong as ever. But then we face the, let's call it...
And not just as an idea, as an operating system that delivers to its citizens.
No, we face both the internal challenge, let's call it the strain of civilization in a time of profound changes, and we see it in the rise of these particular parties. The external one, which we might refer to as the empire, or the empire striking back. I would say the fearful empire striking back. You refer to Russia and you refer to China. No question that Russia has turned more authoritarian and fearful of what is called colored revolutions. And this is not a symbol of the strength of the political system of Russia. It's rather the fear of the leadership of what democracy in the surrounding areas might bring. And the same when we see a more authoritarian tendency, distinctly so, under Xi Jinping in China. Is this a source of pride or strength in China? No, I think it's fear for the stability of their political system. And that, of course, that does influence the strength of democracy in the world. But let's not forget, I mean, what we've seen during the last few months, we saw the 16th parliamentary election in the biggest democracy of the world in India, with a peaceful transfer of power. We saw the third presidential election in Indonesia, with a change peaceful as well, the country with the biggest numbers of Muslims in the world. We even saw an election in Afghanistan, and we are in the middle of a somewhat complicated, but still, the first ever democratic transition of power in a country that has never known either democracy or transitions, only knows power by outside forces. So there are some bright spots after all.
President Turk, what is your view? Do you see democracy in crisis, and do you buy this idea that Minister Bills has just put forward, that in fact we're not seeing strength in China and Russia, we're seeing fear, and the product of that fear is this new aggressiveness, whether in Ukraine or the South China Sea?
Well, I think that the context for the answer to this question is very simple. I think democracy is still the dominant form of governance in the world. And I think that all discussions have to start from here. This is the dominant system of governance. Widespread, there has been progress in the past decades, but of course there have also been disappointments. And I think that if one looks back to the sentiments of 1989, one has to understand that 1989 was the annus mirabilis in Europe, and therefore whatever was expected then was not necessarily completely realistic. So I think that one has to look into these questions from the perspective of realistic assessment of the power of democracy, which is undiminished. Then, of course, the questions arise as to what people expect from democracy. I think that we should never forget that people expect democracy to deliver. They don't like democracy only because it is democratic or because it is aesthetically superior to other forms of governance. They want it to deliver. Now, what democracy should deliver depends on circumstances. It's not only growth of GDP. Let us remember, in the European Union some 5 years ago, there was a discussion whether some other values should be promoted because growth was not seen as being in question at that time. Fitoussi report, for example, Sen Fitoussi report was an expression of that. So I think the political class has to be very careful in assessing what people expect and then, of course, try to deliver. Now, of course, we understand that in a globalized world, when globalized forces of globalization have created circumstances in which not all progressed and there have been serious problems, the crisis of democracy is a reality. But this is not the first time that crisis happens. I mean, those of us who remember the discussion of 1970s...
By crisis, what do you mean? Do you mean that these democracies, our democracies, are threatened, that they might collapse?
I think that the crisis means, first of all, a higher level of disappointment with what democracy provides, the cargo delivery. And secondly, in our era, at our time, I think one can describe the crisis of democracy essentially in terms of crisis of confidence. I think that political class today in democratic countries has to ask itself, are we creating the right kind of confidence among citizens. And that doesn't depend only on the quality of politicians. It also depends on good understanding of the changes in the citizenry. Citizens nowadays are much more consumers than they were in the past. They seek instant results. And of course, politics is more difficult nowadays than it used to be. You mentioned in your introduction that in Europe, politicians think from 1 hour to another. Democracy nowadays requires quick results or quick gratification of some kind. And
that's impossible. You can't produce anything in an hour.
Certainly not. But it is important to understand that that is the problem of the citizenry. It's not only a problem of the quality of political class. Citizens in our era have become much more consumers. Citizens in the past were also much more workers or soldiers defending the country. Attachment to the democratic achievement was more general. Now expectations are much stronger. And then finally, there is an aspect which I think should be given a serious thought through. That is how much expectations can really be fulfilled. I mean, how does one discuss the realistic expectations with citizens? We need more reflection on that, and I think we need better techniques than we currently have.
President Turk, do you think democracy is for everyone? And if not, why not?
Well, I think that there are several parallel and sometimes competing sources of legitimacy of state power. Democracy is, of course, the dominant one and the most desired one, but it is not the only one. There is questions of ethnic belonging sometimes figure very prominently in the calculus of legitimacy. And in ethnically complex society, it is always important to combine the two. I mean, the democratic principle and the ethnic principle.
Doesn't democracy offer the best opportunity to do that? Look at the United States, or compare the United States and some of the societies being torn apart in the Middle East today.
Well, there is a slight difference between countries which are ethnically diverse as a result of immigration and those whose ethnic diversity is based on historically and territorially established ethnic identities. And of course, solutions depend. Let's take Lebanon as a country which has a very old tradition of combining the one man, one vote principle with the ethnic and religious identities. I'm not suggesting that this is a good formula, but it is a realistic formula in the circumstances. Now, this all relates to two Greek words. One is demos, which is older, I think, linguistically, which I think should be more fundamental, and the other is ethnos, which is, I think, biblical and more recent, historically speaking. It should be added to the equation, and if that is done properly, and that's not easy to do, then, of course, legitimate governance can be the result.
Carl, why do you think the results of the Arab Spring, which was the biggest liberalizing movement in the world since 1989, and seemed to offer the promise of getting out of this paralyzing and very negative confrontation of dictatorship, military dictatorship on the one hand, and jihadi on the other, and offer an avenue, particularly in the largest state, Egypt. Why do you think this seems to have failed? Is the Arab world just not suited to democracy? Did we in the West make big mistakes? How do you explain it?
I think you have to look at the different countries from slightly different perspective. The country that I perhaps know somewhat, not too much about, is perhaps Egypt, which is of course by far the biggest, by far the most important, and where the failure has been by far the most tragic. Because Egypt, in my opinion, was a country that had the possibility to gradually move towards a democracy. Cairo is an immensely sophisticated city as well. It has a middle class, it has intellectuals, it has thousands of years of traditions. It should be able to move towards a more pluralistic political system. It wasn't allowed to do so. And it wasn't allowed to do so primarily by internal factors, who, for reasons that we can discuss whether they were valid or not, did not allow this sort of messy process to go on. I mean, no question there were made mistakes done in Egypt. No question that some of those that came to power wasn't sufficiently sophisticated, sufficiently mature, sufficiently wise. But there's always a sort of shakedown cruise of a new democracy before it matures. And that was not allowed to happen in Egypt. And that, I think, is a horrible, true historic tragedy. It is now a more repressive society than it was under Mubarak before the Tahrir Square revolution. But this is not going to last. I think it is creating the conditions for something that is going to be truly difficult, whether it's a couple of years or a couple of decades in front of us, I don't know.
Yeah, there was one election which produced Morsi with 51% of the vote, and then we went right back to 96% with Sisi, which is pretty much the standard for the Arab world. But do you buy the argument that Egypt's used to a pharaoh, Russia's used to a czar? You can't change the cultures of these societies, the fundamental cultures, and therefore democracy is suited to certain places, yes, but it cannot take root in others because of those kinds of cultural references.
No, I don't buy that at all. I mean, political and cultural traditions are very different. I mean, Sweden did used to have an absolute ruler in the form of a king for whatever, 500-600 years. We don't have that any longer, and we live sort of relatively happily in spite of that. So a constitution and things like that, yeah, that will be different in different political contexts. But the basic freedoms, the basic elections, the basic pluralism, that is the very sort of core of democracy. If it works in India, it can work anywhere. If it works in Indonesia, there's no reason whatsoever why it won't work in Egypt. Then, of course, when you go from a very repressive regime to something else, and when, to take the Egyptian example, I mean, those that were ruling Egypt for a long time, since 54, say, or pharaohs or whatever, they had been monopolizing state power. And then suddenly you take forces that were completely outside, and they are brought in by democracy, by democratic election. Of course, mistakes are made, no question about that. And you must allow that process to run its course. That was not allowed, and we have ended up with the situation that we have now.
Do you agree, President?
Well, not entirely. I think that the cultural tradition, cultural context is important, and it does define to a large extent the limit of the possible. But then I think one has to look at...
So we shouldn't be too ambitious about spreading democracy.
We should be ambitious about spreading democracy, but we also have to know what is essential at a given time. Let me give you an example. Talking about Arab Spring in North Africa, and Carl mentioned the mistakes made in Egypt. I think one of the key mistakes was that the process of constitution making went too fast and too late. I mean, the fact that Egypt didn't have a transitional head of state, a transitional government, and allow the constitutional process to take a year or two was a mistake. And that's something that Egyptian specialists, people with their own deep experience in politics in Egypt would clearly recognize. But let's take a positive example, the example of Tunisia, where the provisional arrangements were put in place and constitution making took a little longer, but it produced a very good result. And what I would like to propose is that the international attention be paid to Tunisia, to the experience of Tunisia. Tunisia is practically absent from the world media, and that's bad.
We like bad news, you know.
That's too bad. I think that if you want to promote democracy, you have to pay attention to success stories. Nothing succeeds like success, and I think that Tunisia has been a success. Now, when we are talking about the quote-unquote failure of Arab Spring, I think we are dealing with rather superficial concepts. I mean, was there Arab Spring? What really happened in different countries? Are they entirely comparable? They are certainly not identical. And what went wrong in one country and what went right in another country is something that has to be given better attention.
But surely there was a lot in common in that people rose up against dictators who had been imposing their will on them for 40 plus years in the case of Gaddafi, 30 plus years in the case of Mubarak. The Assad family is still there after 45 years. It's pretty clear what the fundamental urge was, isn't it?
What we know today is that that common denominator is not sufficiently solid to provide the answers. I mean, answers depend really very much on specifics of each country and also on the way the transition is handled. And my hypothesis here would be that the critical element here is the constitution making. If the initial upheaval allows a constitutional reform, then that constitutional reform has to be managed, guided in a way which produces a real constitution. And constitution is not a piece of paper only. It's not something that some wise lawyers will draft. It is something that people can believe in. And that seems to be working in Tunisia and hasn't happened in Egypt. Now, I think that that lesson should not be overlooked.
Cal, we've talked a bit about short-termism here and the way social media, the media in general, the digital revolution just corners politicians. California has just recently created a committee for long-term thinking or something of the like in order to counter that, in order to try to see beyond those cypress trees out there to what lies in the future. How do democracies deal with this issue? Look at Europe, it's drifting. Nobody's made a serious speech about the future of Europe that I've seen in a very long time. People are just dealing with situations. Chancellor Merkel is dealing with holding Europe together while calming the irritation of Germans at having to bail out so many countries. All the leaders of Europe are just coping with situations. So how do we, and this is here to stay, Twitter's not going away, how do you think democracies can better plan ahead and so satisfy more of their citizens?
I think perhaps we have a tendency to look at what was there in the past as everything was good. Politicians were delivering longer speeches, there was no Twitter, and there was wisdom and strategic foresight. I'm not quite certain that was the case. I wasn't around for all of that particular time, but I'm not quite certain that is the case. I do think that we who are more or less elected politicians, I'm not one any longer, but anyhow, we should not underestimate our electorates. My experience, also going through this particular election campaign, but X numbers of them, is that voters actually want to listen to serious politicians. They like the one-liners, and they like to read the Bild Zeitung, perhaps, to take one example from Germany, but they do appreciate people who give longer speeches and treat them seriously. And if you take Chancellor Merkel, if you listen to her speeches, it can be fairly long. She's not a particularly powerful speaker, to put it mildly, and it's in German, obviously. But she's the most
German's not good?
Well, it's not done for rhetoric, to put it in that way. But she's one of the most respected politicians of Europe. And she's re-elected time after time, in spite of being sort of contrary to the conventional wisdom of being populist, being short-term, speaking in one-liners. So I think political leadership, as a matter of fact, does work when exercised. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is trying to exercise it, and I do agree with you, there should be more politicians who should try to exercise it.
Of course, Chancellor Merkel is delivering for her country. The German economy is growing, and the general level of well-being and wealth of Germans is also growing, which is not the case in much of Europe, certainly has not been the case in Greece, which has had to go through a pretty devastating austerity program. So what to do about the economy and about this feeling in many European democracies that the democracy is no longer a reality, it's just something held up, but beyond it lies Brussels, Beyond it lies international financial markets, the real room for choice and maneuver of politicians to move out of a neoliberal consensus, if you like, is limited. What to do about that disgruntlement in Europe, which I think is partly behind the rise of the far right?
It is, but that is a question of trying to be sort of responsible politicians and tell the public how it is. I mean, why did Greece got into problems? We know that. It was spending far beyond its means. And if you do that, and it has been done before in history, not only by Greece, but by other countries as well, sooner or later it goes bust. Call that a neoliberal theory or call it Marxist theory, it's as simple as that. And when you go bust, you need to sort it out. Is that painful? Yes, it is painful. Can it be done? Yes, it can be done. And we just listen to the Prime Minister on what has been done. Sweden went bust to use these somewhat simplistic terms, in the early 90s. Did we have a painful time sorting it out? Yes, I shouldn't compare it with Greece, but still by Swedish standards, certainly painful. Did we benefit from sorting it out? Yes, we did. Was there an amount of political leadership involved in it? Yes, there was. So it is perfectly doable. Germany was, I mean, go back 15 years in time, or 10 years in time, and Germany was widely seen as the sick man of Europe, if you remember that. And they did do some fairly painful economic reforms. And now we tend to forget the mess that they had 10, 15 years ago.
Do you think France is capable of something like that?
Well, now we're getting to the very difficult questions. No, but I have faith in humanity.
Democratic humanity.
Yeah, no, I think. But the dilemma when we talk about economic affairs is, of course, to do the right things before the crisis is so deep that it becomes rather desperate. And here we have the issues that worry us quite a lot, both France and Italy, whether they will be able to muster in time their political energy to do the right things before it gets really bad and start to affect the rest of the European economy too severely.
President Turk, your country emerged from communist Europe. I'm tempted to say the prison of communist Europe. You went through a brief but bloody war as Yugoslavia broke up. You watched the rest of what had been your country plunged into a horrific war that went on for several years. You paid a price for your freedom, and it's now the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall that precipitated all these events. If you were making a speech looking forward to the next 25 years and we're trying to reinvigorate the belief in democracy of your citizens and of European citizens in general, what would you say?
No, I would say have faith in European integration. That would be the key. And of course, I would add many things. And I think it's really quite simple to say that in the Balkans in general, several countries are not yet members of the European Union, and I think they have to come closer and eventually become members. So that remains a very important programmatic priority. And of course,
what about Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine also has to be given European perspective. When I was president of Slovenia, I went to Strasbourg, to European Parliament, I spoke about this. And after my speech, some European parliamentarians came to me and said, you can't be serious. Ukraine is too complicated, too large, and promising European perspective to Ukraine now in 2008 is impossible. I believe that Ukraine deserves European perspective, needs to be helped to get there, and needs to be helped in a way which would also stabilize the wider region. But I would like, if you allow me, since Angela Merkel was mentioned as a person who is making only long speeches, and when I heard that critique, I was reminded of a very short one-liner which she once used when she was asked, what does she say when somebody mentions the word Germany to her? What does she think about? And she said, well, I think about pretty and nicely closed windows, schöne und dichte Fenster. Now, this is a very interesting line because it tells you one thing, that politics remains local. Democratic politics remains local. And we live in a world where economy is global. And that's why I think the difficulty for the European Union to find a way forward which is sufficiently well adjusted to the globalized economy and at the same time satisfies the local politics is extremely difficult and should not be underestimated. And I'm also, like Minister Bildt, somewhat skeptical when people say, you know, the leaders of the past had great visions and they implemented them. Today there are no visions and there is lack of capacity. I think we live in a more complicated world. And of course, if you wish, we can talk about European Union further. But coming back to the question that was addressed to me, I would say yes, European integration continues to be the key project of Europe for strengthening democratic future of Europe.
And what about the economies of Europe? Clearly the fact that they've been stalled has been very undermining of democracy in Europe since 2008. Are you of the enough of austerity school, or do you think that tough, you know, Europe, like any family, it has to balance its books in the end and slowly make its way out of this? And we can bear the political price, as Greece has. Its democracy is intact, even though unemployment rates were soaring. And in Spain, we've also seen youth unemployment rates, you know, around half the youth population.
Well, I think the key answer to this question is growth. And the method to come to that is, well, somewhat perhaps disappointingly, procedure. And I'm mentioning this deliberately because right now we have seen the President of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, has put several concepts, some proposals on how to go about it. That's good. That's a good line he took. And I hope that European Union bodies will follow that we shall have a new Commission soon. And I think what needs to be done in European Union in a short run is to reinvigorate what is called the community method. At the time of crisis, there has been an exceeding reliance on the European Council, the intergovernmental processes, and I think inadvertently the community method suffered somewhat. It is still there, but it is not as strong as it should be. Now the time has come to restore community method, that is the centrality of the European Commission and closer cooperation of governments as the first priority in the modus operandi of European Union. That's the way to do things to promote growth as a serious priority of this time.
Carl, how damaging to the view of democracy today do you think the current condition of the United States is? The Iraq, followed by 2008, Guantanamo, perception of paralysis, perception that Congress has been bought. All this cumulatively has clearly left some people with the feeling, even now 6 years into the Obama presidency, that the beacon of democracy has dimmed, that the country that embodies the spread of liberalism, the rule of law, democracy is compromised, doesn't meet its own standards. So President Putin, you hear people saying, well, he's justified. You know, what's different about Ukraine as compared to what happened in Libya? You know, the United States has not respected the rule of law. How tarnished, if at all, do you think democracy has become because of US difficulties?
I'm not overly worried. I am worried when I look at the US domestic political scene, which has become very polarized and accordingly paralyzed to a certain extent as well when it comes to dealing with some of the issues that the United States is confronted with. But at the same time, everything is relative in the world. The US economy, if you look at the Western economies, the US economy is the one that is doing the best. So we Europeans might sort of pontificate to the Americans and saying, sort out your problems, but our problems are worse than the ones the Americans having. I mean, we do see problems in the US economy, no question about that, but we see more problems in our economy. So, yeah, and I would be worried, but I'm less worried when I hear the vigor of the American debate about these issues. Because America has this amazing tendency to come back. I mean, go back to the Carter years and the profound sense of crisis that was there in the United States. It bounced back very strongly. And I think that dynamism of American society is still there. I do think we have that in Europe as well, by the way. But I think we are in a slightly more difficult situation now. And we face some tricky issues. I mean, we talked about the Swedish election. We had a Russian election, by the way, yesterday. No one knows anything about that because it's not much of elections nowadays. It's regional elections all over Russia. But we're going to have the Scottish referendum on Thursday. And that, I think, is going to be profoundly important. If we face the breakup of nation states in Europe, then that will start to question principles of governance across the continent, and that might derail some of the efforts that we have to deal with both the foreign policy problems, be they in the east or in the south, or the economic challenges, unemployment and others, that should be higher up on the political agenda. So I'm more worried about Europe than I am of the United States.
Well, you mentioned Scotland. Here's probably the most successful union in history, dating back to 1707.
Yeah.
And it's quite possible that we are 3 days from the end of Great Britain. Does that suggest that voters are just complacent, they're bored, they want action, they're driven by odd urges that don't owe a great deal to logic, that they don't believe there are really serious threats to them? And, you know, after all, an independent Scotland doesn't know what its currency would be, doesn't know what its revenue streams would be, doesn't know if it would be a member of the European Union or not, doesn't know how it would be defended, and yet maybe it's going to take this leap. What does that tell us about the state of democracy today, if anything?
Well, I think it tells us that the issues of governance in an increasing globalized and networked world is getting more complicated. People demand, and the concept that we've had, I mean, the dominating concept in the Western world, or in Europe to be precisely, for the last, say, 200 years, has been build nation states. We didn't have nation states before. We had empires of different sorts or whatever, but then we said nation states, one people, one state, whatever, and that was it. That doesn't really work. The nation state is under threat both from above, globalization, and we require, I agree with that, integration, be that European or be that global, and we demand also decentralization. The Scots or the Welsh or the Flemish or the Catalans or the Åland Island people or go to former Yugoslavia, you can see this particular tendency. So structures of governance are becoming, or must be, somewhat more complex in order to answer both the needs of globalization and the feeling among people that they want to have more say on local affairs, accordingly more complex and requires probably somewhat more political leadership to explain it.
I'm going to throw this open very soon, so if you have any questions, do think about the questions you want to ask, because I'm just going to ask a couple more here and then invite questions from the audience. President Turk, you know, everybody's complaining about democracy, and it's mocked in places like Russia and China. But if you follow the money, and if you follow the people, where are they headed? They're headed toward the democracies. I mean, oligarchs, wherever they are, or people within the Chinese Communist Party who have an inside means to make a lot of cash, I mean, once they've made the cash, where do they want to put it? They want to put it in London, or they want to put it in New York, or they want to put it in Vancouver. The money is hurtling toward the democracies. And incidentally, that is one of the reasons why the middle classes are being so squeezed, certainly in the property markets in those places. And people, of course, be they from Africa or elsewhere, are still lining up. I mean, in the south of England right now, you have people clinging onto the side of trucks and the side of trains trying to get into Britain. And in the northern part, you've got 4.5 million people, it seems, prepared to leave it. So, you know, are we just kind of making up this crisis? I mean, if people around the world, I mean, where you put your money tells you a lot about the place you trust most, where you believe the rule of law exists. If those flows and fluxes are going still in the direction of the major democracies, isn't that a pretty good sign that, in fact, you know, that's where people see their future, that's what people want to invest in, that's the system that best responds to the desires of humanity?
Well, a short answer is yes, and of course it doesn't relate only to money, it relates also to such things as education, real estate and other you know, aspects of good life, and I think that that's pretty obvious. Of course, one also has to understand that money from other parts of the world is very welcome in places like London and other places because it adds to the wealth of the country where money is invested. So I think that in a globalized world, this is a quite natural direction in which things are moving, but that doesn't change certain basic parameters within which governance is organized in different parts of the world. You mentioned China, for example. Now, I have been many times to Singapore and I have seen how proud the Singaporeans are because they believe that they have been a model upon which mainland China has developed its own system of governance because it was tested in a small place, in a city-state, but then it could be applied in a much larger context. Now, I'm mentioning this, it's a pity that today we don't have somebody from Singapore with us to tell us what kind of advantages in the more authoritarian versions of capitalism are appreciated in Asia, for example. It has to do with culture, it has to do with a sense of efficiency, a sense of ability to deliver. And I think this is also these are also parts of reality. Democracy is not the only reality of human condition. It's a very important one, in my opinion, critically important one, but it is not the only one. So, you know, one has to look at all these aspects together and certainly believe in democracy, no doubt about that, but also accept that others, those countries which have opted for a different form of governance will find ways to govern themselves quite efficiently and at the same time try to take advantage of the benefits of cooperation with democratic centers of the world.
I'm not sure you agree with that, do you, Carl?
Well, not entirely, but I was going to say refer to another point that Anita made earlier, and that is where there are problems with democratic governance is, of course, when you have societies which are ethnically, religiously, or culturally too divided. If we go back to our discussion of the Middle East, I still think that Egypt could have made democracy because it's a fairly homogeneous country. Iraq, then we enter into sort of what I call the post-Ottoman space of diversity. And then it becomes somewhat difficult because then democracy tends to be, the country tends to be divided along ethnic lines. And there it can be somewhat difficult. I think it's manageable, but more difficult. That's the story of Singapore as well. Yeah. That very small island in the middle of a world that they saw as hostile, and with ethnic tension that could have exploded the entire place. That was how it started, and then it became successful. But if you look at Singapore today, you see that the pressures are building up. I mean, the governing party actually lost elections. Not altogether, but they are starting to lose elections in Singapore. And they are starting to allow elections in Singapore, which means that the pressure for democracy is there, even in a place that must be seen as fairly successful. And the same will happen in China. I think if we talk about the future of democracy, one of the most interesting places to watch in the next few months is going to be Hong Kong. And see what happens with the promise that was there with the handover of Hong Kong. Hong Kong wasn't a democracy under the British, certainly not. But it was rule of law. And they see democracy as the guarantor of rule of law. And it was equally promised some form of democracy, whether Beijing will honor its promise to Hong Kong of more democratic governance, I think will be one of the most interesting things to watch on the democracy space in the years to come.
Watch Hong Kong. Okay, I'm going to throw this open to the audience. So see a question there, pink shirt, yeah.
Thank you, Roger. Dr. Kroko, European Democratic Party. My question is very clear. We are having a giant deficit of democracy in Europe because on the periphery as well as in the center, we are not facing the issues of corruption and the lack of democracy on the larger institutions. I think that should be priority number one, because if we want to see economic growth, we absolutely need to deal with the cancer of corruption. America has understood this, and even China has understood this, with President Xi today dealing singularly with that issue. In Greece, it has become more of a pyramid rather than a democracy, and I'm very sorry to say the birthplace of democracy do not have such a democratic ideal stronghold. It appears to be that unless we deal with corruption, we will never enjoy the benefits of democracy. And as we all know, open democracies, they have the greatest chance towards economic freedom. I like your comments on that, and thank you.
I certainly agree with that. I mean, one of the biggest threats to democracy, or to the credibility of democracy in a number of countries, is corruption. We see that in the elections in part of the Western Balkans, no question about that. Look at Bosnia, which is facing an election in the next few weeks. We certainly see it in Ukraine, which by all objective standards is a very corrupt place. And then people start to question the political system. But the way to deal with corruption is rule of law. And rule of law, the best way to guarantee rule of law is democracy. So democracy is the way forward, but it needs certainly to address the issues of corruption as we've seen them, for example, in Ukraine. Poland, coming out of communism 25 years ago, was for a while exceedingly corrupt. And they dealt with it, and they have practically nothing of it today. So it is perfectly doable, and it needs to be done.
May I add just one sentence, and that is, I agree with what Minister Bildt has said, but what I would like to add is in the European Union, it still needs to be defined how does the Union as an organization stimulate the fight against corruption within nation states, within member states. I mean, because these are the tasks which are mainly before the national organs. They are the ones who can do it, they are the ones who are expected to do it. Of course, there are supervisory mechanisms in the European Union, but I don't think that the European Union has given enough attention and has developed sufficient instruments to help member states to fight corruption effectively.
Yes, yeah.
My name is Antonis Schwartz. I'm from a parliamentary monitor organization called Woolly Watch. My question is related to TTIP. It's a thing that nobody really talks about much, but it's quite important because it's going to be the biggest trade treaty between the United States and the European Union. So there's been a lot of talk about intransparency, which is also related to the question of my predecessor. And I wanted to ask the panel their opinion on if it should go ahead or not, because as we know, there are huge transparency issues related to it and democratic issues, actually, because this whole treaty is being negotiated in private with lobbyists being on board, but not the general public. And now European Parliament has gotten some access to the document. I just wanted to hear your opinion on it.
You want it?
Well, I'm certainly very much in favor. I think it would be a boost to the European economy, it would be a boost to the American economy, it would be a boost over time also to world trade. I do think that free trade has brought enormous benefit all over the world. And some of the great advances that we've seen during the past few decades of people lifting out of hundreds of millions of people being lifted out of poverty, be that of China or India, is due to the fact and the European Union, which is sort of half of the global economy, is somewhat more tricky. It's somewhat more tricky because tariffs are not very high. So it's a question of regulatory convergence. And that brings into sort of the two political systems that need to define things in the same way. That's been very complicated inside the European Union.
equipped with safety standards.
Absolutely.
And it's the question of standards, or if we're going to go to American standards, if they're going to go to European standards.
Absolutely.
So it's a huge issue.
Well, huge issue, but that's what we've done in Europe. I mean, sorry? Yeah, but no, in exactly the same way. We do it in the same way. I mean, go back a couple of decades before we had sort of a single market in the European Union. A bicycle was defined differently in Greece and Sweden. Accordingly, you couldn't sell bicycles between Sweden and Greece. You have to adjust them. Now we have in some sort of process.
What was the difference?
I don't know. But it was. I mean, the same with cars, where there are still some differences. I mean, you have some
Did you have
safety
three wheels in Sweden?
No, but different safety standards and this. I mean, between Germany and Sweden, we had sort of different points where the safety belt should be attached, and accordingly, we couldn't sell sort of cars freely between the two countries. I mean, that's a standards issue. We still have disputes between Sweden and Denmark on health standards for pigs. But in my opinion, the more we sort these things out, the better for the economic development. We don't necessarily need to define cucumber in exactly the same way. Yeah. That's a myth.
Well, yeah, democracy is laborious, can be, but
trade.
There's a need to reduce. Yes, sir, at the back on the right there. Had your hand up for a while, and then yes, sir. Yeah, if you could also just keep it to questions, please.
I will briefly, though, say that for us that follow social media, and since we spoke about social media and democracy, we know that Minister Bildt is very active on social media. He takes the time to speak in English every day, and we appreciate this very much. Only very few ministers do that, and he sets an example. To my question, since this morning, we spoke a lot about the deterioration of the democratic state in Russia. And I was wondering if any of the panelists feel that the West, Europe, the US, bears some responsibility for that. And if so, what kind of responsibility? Thank you.
Well, I think the responsibility for development in Russia belongs to the people of Russia, and I don't think that the responsibility of the West should be put into the picture as a separate, as an important question. Has
the West been weak in its response? I think that was the question.
Well, weakness, I think that the talk about weakness should be approached with great care. I think politicians have to be smart. Weakness is something which can be easily manipulated. I mean, the critique of weakness is one of the most manipulable qualities in politics. So I don't like the discussions about weakness, because the question is appropriateness and political wisdom. Now, see, there is no substitute for real thought in politics, including in international politics. And I believe that that should be the guiding principle. So using a kind of stereotype such as weakness, such as the need for sanctions and automaticity in sanctions discourse, these are all problematic approaches. I would suggest that very serious thought is given to the question, and that a rather modest approach is taken to the question of how should Russia govern itself. That's to answer your question. But I would like just to make a...
Russia has, for the first time since 1945, annexed part of the territory of a neighboring country. That surely, your field is international law. Sure. Surely that's serious.
Certainly, this is a violation of international law, and of course it should be remedied. The question is what instruments would help to remedy this situation. And what I am questioning is the policy of sanctions, whether they would really help. I'm not sure they will. There is this kind of a preconceived idea that sanctions produce a particular results. I don't think this is necessarily the case. One has to think much more carefully about this and figure out what would remedy the situation. Sanctions, I don't think, do not automatically produce this kind of a result.
I've been told one more question, so that goes to you, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to, being here in Eastern Mediterranean, and we have a neighbor next to Turkey, and I don't think you touched on Turkey, and are there signs of erosion in democracy there? For us, it's an important buffer zone against the East.
Carl, Turkey.
Well, I've never heard that expression.
Talk Turkey, Carl.
No, but yeah, quite I will. I never heard that expression, but of course it is. I mean, a buffer zone towards the east for Greece, but whether the Turks see themselves in that particular light, I'm not quite certain. But I mean, Turkey is a vastly, enormously important, its political development. It's come out of a political history, of course, that has been fairly authoritarian, very authoritarian. If you go to the modernization of Turkey, the Atatürk modernization was fairly authoritarian. That was during the interwar years. And then it went through sort of military dictatorships for a prolonged period. And we now have a period of gradual, I would say, democratization of Turkey, which is facing substantial issues. One of them has to do with corruption. Another one has to do with the extremely important issue of sorting out some of the nationality issues that are there. I mean, the Turkey that Atatürk tried to carve out of the Ottoman Empire was an attempt to build a nation state along the old European model. Say that everyone living on this particular territory is a Turk, come whatever. And that doesn't work in the modern world. And there we have the Kurdish issue and the peace process there, which at the end of the day is a question of redefining the very concept of Turkey that is ongoing. That's a fairly painful and complicated process that we have a profound interest, of course, of helping and assisting. Because if that works, yes, then I think the path for a more complete democracy of Turkey is open. If it doesn't work, I think the path of Turkey will become more complicated, and that will go together with the divisions and the conflicts and the strife in the wider region. And of course, Greece is not very far away.
Well, thank you very much. At that point, we're going to conclude. Thank you very much, Minister/outgoing Minister Bildt and former President Turk. I think Carl Bildt's sparkling form on the day after a defeat is a good beacon for democracies, in that democracies are all about change, bouncing back, resilience, and perhaps when these systems in China and Russia are tested by the real adversity they're going to face at some point, we will see just how adaptable they are in turn. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please join us for a light brunch, supper and cocktail at the back of the Star. Thank you.